In a world where beauty often determines destiny, Margaret's family saw her as their greatest disappointment. While her sisters received marriage proposals and admirers, Margaret was hidden away, considered too plain for polite society. When a wealthy rancher from Texas requested a bride through correspondence, her cruel family saw an opportunity for a twisted joke. They would send their ugly daughter to this unsuspecting man, expecting him to reject her and send her back in shame. But sometimes, the universe has its own plans. Sometimes, what the world calls ugly holds the most beautiful soul. And sometimes, a joke becomes the greatest love story ever told. This is the true story of Margaret Sullivan, the woman who was sent as a cruel prank but found something her beautiful sisters never could. A love that saw past the surface and discovered the extraordinary heart beneath. What happened next would shock her family, transform two lives, and prove that real beauty has nothing to do with what meets the eye. Their joke was about to become her triumph. Margaret Sullivan pressed her face against the cold window of her family's Boston townhouse, watching her younger sister Catherine step into an elegant carriage with yet another suitor. At 26, Margaret had long stopped counting the number of men who had called on her sisters while completely ignoring her existence. The mirror in her bedroom had become her enemy, reflecting back what everyone in her family constantly reminded her. She was the plain one, the unfortunate one, the daughter who would never marry. Her mother, Eleanor Sullivan, swept into the parlor with the air of someone perpetually disappointed by life's cruel jokes. Eleanor had been a celebrated beauty in her youth, and she had expected all three of her daughters to inherit her striking features. Catherine and Isabella had indeed received their mother's delicate bone structure, golden hair, and bright blue eyes. Margaret, however, seemed to have inherited from some distant relative no one wanted to claim. "Margaret, move away from that window," Eleanor commanded, her voice carrying the sharp edge it always held when addressing her eldest daughter. "Mrs. Pritchard, Henderson from next door might see you, and we certainly don't want her reporting to anyone that we have you on display like some common merchant's daughter." Margaret stepped back obediently, her hands clasping the simple brown dress she wore. While her sisters dressed in silks and satins, Margaret's wardrobe consisted of plain fabrics and muted colors, her mother's way of ensuring she didn't draw attention to what Eleanor considered the family's greatest shame. The Sullivan family had built their reputation on beauty and social standing. Margaret's father, Thomas Sullivan, owned a successful shipping business, which provided them with considerable wealth. But in their social circle, money alone wasn't enough. Beauty, charm, and the ability to make advantageous marriages were what truly mattered. Margaret possessed none of these qualities, at least not according to her family's harsh standards. In the privacy of her room that evening, Margaret sat at her small writing desk, working on the accounts for her father's business. Few people knew that she had a brilliant mind for numbers and had been secretly managing much of the company's financial planning for the past 3 years. Her father had discovered her talent by accident when he found her correcting errors in his ledgers. Rather than praise her abilities, he had sworn her to secrecy, insisting that no one should know a woman was handling his business affairs. Margaret found solace in this hidden responsibility. While her sisters spent their days planning their wardrobes and attending social functions, she lost herself in columns of numbers, shipping schedules, and profit calculations. She had single-handedly identified several cost-saving measures that had increased the business's profits by 30%, though her father took full credit for these improvements. As she worked that night, Margaret overheard her parents talking in the study below her room. The walls of the old townhouse were thin, and she had learned to listen carefully to understand her place in the family's future plans. "Something must be done about Margaret," her mother was saying, her voice filled with exasperation. "Catherine has received 2 marriage proposals already, and Isabella will surely be engaged before the year ends. But Margaret, she's becoming an embarrassment. People are starting to ask why our eldest daughter remains unmarried at her age." Her father's voice was gruff when he responded. "What do you suggest, Eleanor? We've tried everything. We've taken her to every social gathering, introduced her to every eligible man in Boston. They take one look at her and immediately gravitate toward her sisters." "Perhaps we should consider sending her to live with your sister in Maine," Eleanor suggested. "At least there she would be out of sight, and people would stop asking uncomfortable questions." Margaret's heart sank as she listened to her parents discuss her future as if she were an unwanted piece of furniture they needed to store in an attic. She had always known her family considered her a burden, but hearing it stated so plainly still cut deeply. The conversation below continued, with her parents debating various options for removing Margaret from their immediate social circle. As she listened, Margaret made a quiet promise to herself. Somehow, she would find a way to prove her worth, even if her family could never see it. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Sullivan household. James Peterson, a family friend and fellow businessman, arrived with news that would change Margaret's life forever, though none of them could have predicted it at the time. Peterson sat in the Sullivan parlour, accepting tea from Eleanor, while Thomas joined them for what appeared to be an important discussion. Margaret, who had been instructed to keep Catherine and Isabella company upstairs, found herself listening from the top of the staircase, a habit she had developed to stay informed about family matters that directly affected her future. "I've received an interesting proposition from a business associate in Texas," Peterson was saying, his voice carrying excitement. "There's a rancher there, Samuel Crawford, who has built quite an empire for himself. He owns thousands of acres and has become one of the wealthiest men in the territory. The fascinating thing is, he's looking for a wife." Eleanor leaned forward with interest. "A wealthy rancher seeking a wife? How intriguing. What are his requirements?" "He's been too busy building his business to court anyone locally," Peterson explained. "He's requested that suitable families in Boston recommend a bride for him. He's offering a very generous settlement and has promised that his future wife will want for nothing. He specifically asked for someone with good character and intelligence, someone who could help him build a proper household in Texas." Thomas stroked his beard thoughtfully. "This could be an excellent opportunity for Catherine. She would be perfect for such a position. Actually," Peterson continued, "Crawford has been quite specific about what he doesn't want. He's tired of superficial women who care only about appearances. He wants someone substantial, someone with depth and practical skills. He's made it clear that he values character over conventional beauty." Eleanor frowned at this unexpected requirement. "How unusual. Most successful men prefer to marry beautiful women who can enhance their social standing." "Crawford is different," Peterson insisted. "He's built his fortune through hard work and intelligence. He wants a partner who shares those values. He's actually stated that he would prefer to avoid the typical society belle in favor of someone more substantial." From her hiding place on the stairs, Margaret felt her heart begin to race. For the first time in her life, she was hearing about a man who might value the qualities she possessed rather than the beauty she lacked. The conversation continued for another hour, with Peterson providing more details about Samuel Crawford and his unusual request for a bride. By the time he left, Margaret could see the wheels turning in her parents' minds. She hurried back to her room, her thoughts spinning with possibility and hope. That evening, the Sullivan family gathered for dinner, and the topic of Crawford's proposition dominated the conversation. Catherine and Isabella were both excited by the prospect of moving to Texas and becoming the wife of a wealthy rancher, each certain that she would be the obvious choice. "I think Catherine should go," Isabella declared, cutting her meat with delicate precision. "She has the better temperament for frontier life."
"Nonsense," Catherine replied, tossing her golden curls.
"I'm clearly more suitable. I have better organizational skills, and I've always been more adventurous." Eleanor watched her two younger daughters debate while Thomas remained thoughtfully quiet. Margaret sat at the end of the table, picking at her food while her mind raced with thoughts she dared not voice aloud. "Girls," their mother finally interrupted, "this decision isn't yours to make. Your father and I will determine who is best suited for this opportunity." As the evening wore on, Margaret retreated to her room and pulled out a sheet of writing paper. For the first time in her life, she was going to advocate for herself. She began composing a letter to her parents, outlining all the reasons why she would be the perfect choice for Samuel Crawford. She wrote about her mathematical abilities, her organizational skills, and her practical nature. She mentioned her experience managing household accounts and her ability to work hard without complaint. Most importantly, she wrote about her genuine desire to build something meaningful with someone who valued substance over superficial qualities. When she finished the letter, Margaret sat staring at it for a long time. She knew that giving this letter to her parents would be the boldest thing she had ever done. It would also likely result in mockery and dismissal, but something inside her refused to let this opportunity pass without at least trying. The next morning, Margaret placed the sealed letter on her father's desk before anyone else in the house was awake. Then she went about her daily routine, helping with breakfast preparations and organizing her father's correspondence, while her heart pounded with nervous anticipation. When Thomas discovered the letter during his morning review of business papers, his reaction was exactly what Margaret had expected. She heard him call for her mother, and soon both parents were in the study, their voices raised in a mixture of shock and outrage. "The audacity," Eleanor was saying. "How dare she suggest that she would be suitable for such a position? Does she have no understanding of her own limitations? Perhaps we should read what she's written before dismissing it entirely." Thomas said, though his tone suggested he found the whole situation absurd. Margaret continued with her morning tasks, but every fibre of her being was focused on the conversation in the study. She heard paper rustling, followed by long periods of silence, then more discussion between her parents. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Thomas called for her to join them in the study. Margaret entered the room with her head held high, determined to maintain her dignity regardless of their response to her letter. "Sit down, Margaret," her father instructed, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Eleanor stood by the window, her expression unreadable, while Thomas held Margaret's letter in his hands. "This letter of yours," he began slowly, "contains some interesting points. You've made arguments about your qualifications that we hadn't previously considered." Margaret's heart leaped with hope, but she forced herself to remain calm and wait for him to continue. "However," Thomas continued, and Margaret's hope began to deflate, "you must understand that this opportunity requires someone who can represent our family's social standing, Mr. Checkles. Crawford may claim to value substance over beauty, but he's still a successful businessman who will expect his wife to enhance his reputation." "But father," Margaret said quietly, "the letter Mr. Brute Peterson shared suggested that Mr. Crawford specifically wants to avoid the typical society woman. Perhaps my different qualities might actually be what he's seeking." Eleanor turned from the window, her expression sharp. "Margaret, you're being ridiculous. No matter what this man claims to want, the reality is that successful men marry beautiful women. It's the natural order of things." "Then why not let me try?" Margaret asked, her voice growing stronger. "If I'm truly as unsuitable as you believe, Mr. Crawford will simply send me back, and you'll be no worse off than you are now." The room fell silent as her parents exchanged glances. Margaret could see them considering her words, and for a moment she dared to hope that they might actually agree to her request. What she couldn't know was that her parents were indeed considering her proposal, but not for the reasons she hoped. In their minds, a cruel plan was beginning to form. One that would rid them of their embarrassing eldest daughter, while teaching her a harsh lesson about her place in the world. 3 days passed before Margaret's parents gave her their decision, and those 3 days felt like the longest of her life. She continued her daily routines, managing her father's accounts and helping with household tasks. But her mind was constantly occupied with thoughts of Texas and the possibility of a new life. On the 4th morning, her father called her into his study once again. This time, both her sisters were present, sitting on the small sofa near the fireplace, with expressions that Margaret couldn't quite read. Her mother stood beside her father's desk, and there was something in her posture that made Margaret feel uneasy. "We've made our decision regarding Mr. Strout, Crawford's proposition," Thomas announced without preamble. "After considerable discussion, your mother and I have concluded that you should be the one to go to Texas." Margaret's heart soared, but before she could express her gratitude, her father continued speaking. "However, you must understand that this is not because we believe you're the best choice," he said, his tone becoming stern. "Rather, we've decided that this experience might teach you some valuable lessons about your proper place in the world." Eleanor stepped forward, her smile cold and calculating. "You see, Margaret, your father and I believe that once Mr. Crawford meets you in person, he'll quickly realize that he's made a mistake. When he sends you back to Boston, perhaps you'll finally understand why we've always told you to have realistic expectations about your future." The joy that had been building in Margaret's chest suddenly turned to ice. She looked at her sisters and saw smirks on both their faces. Catherine was barely containing her laughter, while Isabella watched with the kind of fascination people reserve for watching accidents happen. "You're sending me as a joke," Margaret said quietly, the full realization of their plan becoming clear. "We prefer to think of it as a learning experience," Eleanor replied smoothly. "You've always been so stubborn about accepting your limitations. Perhaps a public rejection from a wealthy man will finally help you understand reality." Thomas leaned back in his chair, seemingly pleased with their solution. "Mr. Peterson will arrange your travel to Texas. You'll have 2 weeks to prepare for the journey. We've already sent a letter to Mr. Walker Palatizer. Crawford recommending you highly and emphasizing your unique qualities." Margaret felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her own parents were sending her across the country specifically hoping she would fail and be humiliated. The cruelty of it took her breath away. "What if I refuse to go?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then you can pack your belongings and find somewhere else to live," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "We've tolerated your presence in this house long enough. It's time you learned to stand on your own, one way or another." Margaret looked around the room at her family, the people who should have loved and protected her, and saw only indifference and malicious amusement. In that moment, something inside her hardened into determination. If they wanted to send her away as a joke, she would go. But she would not be the victim they expected her to be. "Very well," she said, standing with as much dignity as she could muster. "I'll go to Texas, and I'll make the most of this opportunity, regardless of your expectations." As she left the study, she heard Catherine whisper to Isabella, "This is going to be so amusing. I almost feel sorry for the poor man." Margaret climbed the stairs to her room and closed the door behind her, finally allowing herself to feel the full impact of what had just happened. She sat on her bed and let the tears come, mourning not just for her current situation, but for the family love she had always hoped for but would never receive. But after allowing herself that moment of grief, Margaret wiped her eyes and began to plan. If her family wanted to send her away expecting her to fail, she would prove them wrong. She would go to Texas, meet Samuel Crawford, and find a way to make this arrangement work, not to please her family, but to build the life she wanted for herself. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret threw herself into preparation for her journey with a determination that surprised everyone in the household. While her sisters had assumed she would spend the time moping or begging to stay, Margaret instead researched everything she could about Texas, ranching, and frontier life. She visited the Boston Public Library daily, reading about cattle breeding, land management, and the practical skills needed for life on a ranch. She studied maps of Texas, learning about the climate, geography, and economic conditions. She even found several books written by women who had moved west and documented their experiences. At home, Margaret began practicing skills she thought might be useful in Texas. She learnt to bake bread from scratch, improved her sewing abilities, and even convinced the family's cook to teach her how to preserve food and manage supplies efficiently. Every evening, she wrote detailed notes about what she had learned, creating her own guide for frontier living. Her family watched these preparations with a mixture of amusement and bewilderment. They had expected Margaret to be devastated by their plan, but instead, she seemed energized and focused in a way they had never seen before. "Look at her," Eleanor said to Thomas one evening as they watched Margaret reading another book about ranch management in the parlor. "She actually believes she can make this work. It's almost pathetic." Thomas nodded, but there was a hint of unease in his expression. "Perhaps we should have been more direct about our intentions. She seems to be taking this quite seriously." "Good," Eleanor replied firmly. "The harder the fall, the more valuable the lesson." Meanwhile, Margaret was indeed taking her preparation seriously, but not for the naive reasons her family assumed. She understood exactly what they were trying to do, and she was determined to turn their cruel joke into her triumph. Every skill she learned, every piece of knowledge she gained, was a weapon in her arsenal against their expectations. 1 week before her departure, Margaret made a decision that would prove crucial to her future success. She used her secret savings, money she had accumulated over the years from small gifts and careful budgeting, to purchase a completely new wardrobe for her journey. Instead of the plain brown and grey dresses her mother had always forced her to wear, Margaret bought practical but attractive clothing suitable for travel and frontier life. She chose deep blues, forest greens, and rich burgundies, colours that complemented her brown hair and brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret was dressing to please herself rather than to disappear into the background. She also invested in a sturdy pair of boots, a warm coat, and practical undergarments designed for an active lifestyle. When she tried on her new clothes in the privacy of her room, Margaret barely recognized herself. The woman looking back at her from the mirror wasn't conventionally beautiful, but she looked strong, capable, and confident. On the day before her departure, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Mr. Farquhar Peterson arrived to finalize the travel arrangements and to give her some additional information about Samuel Crawford. "I must tell you, Miss Margaret," Peterson said as they sat in the parlor, "I've received another letter from Mr. Crawford, and he seems quite eager to meet you. Your parents' recommendation was apparently very persuasive." Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with curiosity. "Did he say anything specific about his expectations?" Peterson smiled kindly. "Actually, yes. He mentioned that he was particularly impressed by your mathematical abilities and your practical experience managing business affairs. He said it was refreshing to find a woman with such substantial qualifications." Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. She turned to look at her parents, who were both staring at Peterson with confused expressions.
"I'm sorry," Eleanor interrupted, "but what mathematical abilities and business experience are you referring to?"
Peterson looked equally confused. "Why, the information you provided in your letter of recommendation, He wrote extensively about Margaret's work managing your shipping business accounts and her exceptional skill with numbers and financial planning. The room fell silent as Margaret's parents realized what had happened. In their eagerness to send Margaret away, they had asked Mr. Paula Beaker Peterson to draft a letter of recommendation, telling him to emphasize her practical qualities, without specifying what those were. Peterson, who had observed Margaret's work in her father's office during his business visits, had naturally assumed her parents wanted him to highlight her genuine business skills. Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. Yes, well, Margaret has indeed helped with some minor clerical work. Minor? Peterson laughed. Thomas, don't be so modest. Everyone in our business circle knows that your profits have increased dramatically over the past few years. If Margaret has been contributing to that success, Crawford will be very fortunate indeed. Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction as she watched her parents' discomfort. Their plan to send her away as a joke had accidentally resulted in an honest and genuinely impressive recommendation. That evening, as Margaret packed her belongings for the journey, she reflected on the strange twists of fate that had led her to this moment. Her family had intended to humiliate her, but their cruel scheme had instead opened a door to possibilities she had never imagined. She carefully folded her new dresses and packed her research notes alongside her personal belongings. At the bottom of her trunk, she placed the books she had purchased about ranching and frontier life, along with a journal where she planned to document her experiences in Texas. As she prepared for sleep on her last night in Boston, Margaret made a promise to herself. Whatever happened in Texas, she would not return to this house as the defeated, humiliated daughter her family expected. She would either make a success of her new life, or she would find another path forward. But she would never again allow anyone to treat her as less than she was worth. The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect weather for travel. Margaret dressed in one of her new outfits, a practical traveling dress in deep blue wool with a matching coat. She had styled her hair in a more flattering way than usual, and for the first time in years she looked in the mirror with something approaching approval. Her family gathered in the front hall to see her off, though their farewell felt more like a performance than a genuine emotional moment. Catherine and Isabella both kissed her cheek and wished her luck, but Margaret could see the smirks they were hiding. Her parents were more formal, offering stiff words of advice and reminding her to conduct herself properly in Texas. Remember, Margaret, her mother said as Peterson loaded Margaret's trunk onto the carriage. If things don't work out as you hope, you can always return to Boston and we'll discuss your future options. Margaret looked at her mother steadily. I don't think that will be necessary, Mother. I have a feeling that Texas will suit me very well. As the carriage pulled away from the Sullivan townhouse, Margaret didn't look back. She was too busy looking forward, toward a future that might hold everything her family believed she could never have. Behind her, she left a family who saw her as a joke. Ahead of her waited a man who might see her as she truly was. Not the ugly daughter, but a woman of substance, intelligence, and worth. The journey to Texas would take 2 weeks by train and stagecoach. Margaret settled into her seat with one of her research books and began reading about cattle breeding techniques. If Samuel Crawford wanted a wife who could help him build his ranch, she intended to be ready. Her family's cruel joke was about to become her greatest triumph, and she couldn't wait to prove them wrong. The train pulled away from Boston's North Station with a great rush of steam and clanging metal, carrying Margaret towards a future she could barely imagine. As the familiar landmarks of her hometown disappeared behind her, she felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that made her heart race. For the first time in her 26 years, she was truly on her own, responsible for her own destiny. Margaret had secured a private compartment for the journey, using money from her secret savings account that her family knew nothing about. Over the years, she had carefully saved small amounts from birthday gifts and the few coins her father occasionally gave her for her work on his accounts. This nest egg, modest as it was, represented her independence and her determination to make this journey on her own terms. As the train rolled through the Massachusetts countryside, Margaret pulled out the journal she had brought for documenting her experiences. On the first page she wrote, "Today begins my real life. Whatever happens in Texas, I will not return to Boston as the same woman who left it." The journey would take her through New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and several other states before reaching Texas. Margaret had planned her route carefully, with stops in major cities where she could stretch her legs, purchase supplies, and continue her research about her destination. Her first major stop was New York City, where she had a 6-hour layover before catching the train west. Margaret had never been to such a large city, and she was amazed by the bustling crowds, towering buildings, and endless energy of the place. She used her time there to visit a bookstore, where she purchased additional guides about Texas and ranching, and to buy practical supplies for the remainder of her journey. In the bookstore, Margaret struck up a conversation with another customer, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Bed, Helen Morrison, who was also traveling west. Mrs. Beaver. Morrison was relocating to Kansas to live with her daughter's family after being widowed, and she was full of practical advice about traveling alone as a woman. The key, Mrs. R. Morrison told her as they shared coffee in the station restaurant, is to project confidence even when you don't feel it. People will try to take advantage of a woman traveling alone, but if you act like you know exactly what you're doing, most will leave you be. Margaret absorbed this advice gratefully. Mrs. Morrison also shared information about the best hotels in the cities where Margaret would be stopping, recommended trustworthy carriage services, and warned her about common scams that targeted travellers. When it came time to board their respective trains, Mrs. Morrison pressed a small pistol into Margaret's hands along with a box of ammunition. "I pray you'll never need it," she said seriously. "But a woman alone in frontier territory should know how to protect herself." "Do you know how to use a gun?" Margaret shook her head, and Mrs. Morrison quickly gave her basic instructions on loading, aiming, and firing the weapon. "Practice with empty chambers when you're alone in your hotel rooms," she advised. "Get comfortable with the weight and mechanics. Hopefully, you'll never need to fire it, but confidence with a weapon can prevent situations where you might have to use it." As Margaret's train pulled away from New York, she reflected on this unexpected friendship. Mrs. Morrison was the first person in years who had treated her as an equal, offering advice and assistance without condescension or pity. It gave Margaret hope that she might find similar acceptance in Texas. The journey through Pennsylvania and Ohio gave Margaret her first real taste of the American frontier. The cities grew smaller and farther apart, the countryside became wilder and more rugged. She saw her first buffalo herds in the distance, watched prairie dogs scurrying across vast grasslands, and marveled at skies that seemed impossibly wide and open. In Chicago, Margaret had another extended layover, and she used the time to visit a livestock market where she could observe cattle trading firsthand. She spent hours watching ranchers and buyers negotiate deals, listening to their discussions about breeding, feed costs, and market prices. Several men attempted to strike up conversations with her, but Margaret deflected their attention by claiming to be researching an article for a women's magazine about frontier economics. One older rancher, impressed by the intelligent questions she asked, spent an hour explaining the finer points of cattle breeding to her. "Most folks think ranching is just about having land and cows," he told her, "but it's really about understanding bloodlines, nutrition, disease prevention, and market timing. A good rancher needs to be part farmer, part businessman, and part veterinarian." Margaret took careful notes of everything he told her, adding this practical knowledge to the growing store of information she was accumulating. By the time she left Chicago, she felt she had gained the equivalent of a basic education in ranching fundamentals. The train journey through Missouri and into Kansas brought new challenges. The accommodations became more basic, the food less refined, and the other passengers rougher around the edges. Margaret encountered her first real test of Mrs. Morrison's advice about projecting confidence when a group of men in the dining car began making inappropriate comments about her traveling alone. "Where's your husband, darling?" one of them called out as she tried to eat her dinner in peace. "Shouldn't a pretty lady like you be home taking care of her man?"
Margaret looked up from her meal and met the man's gaze steadily.
"My husband is waiting for me in Texas," she said clearly, her voice carrying just enough authority to suggest she wasn't someone to be trifled with. "He owns a very large ranch there, and he's not the sort of man who tolerates people bothering his wife." The mention of a wealthy, powerful husband in Texas had the desired effect. The men lost interest and turned their attention elsewhere, leaving Margaret to finish her meal in peace. She was proud of how she had handled the situation, using her wits rather than confrontation to protect herself. As the train crossed into Kansas, Margaret began to see the landscape that would define her new home. The endless grasslands stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by occasional farmhouses, windmills, and distant cattle herds. The sky dominated everything, vast and blue and filled with clouds that cast moving shadows across the prairie. Margaret found this landscape both beautiful and intimidating. She was accustomed to the enclosed, civilized world of Boston, where buildings and trees limited your view and created a sense of safety through familiarity. This open country seemed to offer unlimited possibilities, but it also suggested that survival would depend on strength, intelligence, and determination, rather than social connections and family money. In Topeka, Kansas, Margaret switched from the train to a stagecoach for the final portion of her journey to Texas. The stagecoach was far less comfortable than the train, and the roads were rough and dusty, but Margaret was amazed by the sense of adventure she felt as they rolled across the prairie. Her fellow passengers in the stagecoach were a diverse group: a traveling salesman heading to Dallas, a young minister and his wife relocating to start a new church, and an elderly woman visiting her son's family. Margaret enjoyed the conversations during their rest stops, learning about their various reasons for traveling to Texas and their hopes for the future. The minister's wife, Sarah, was particularly kind to Margaret. She was only a few years younger than Margaret, but seemed much more worldly and confident. During one of their overnight stops at a way station, Sarah helped Margaret restyle her hair in a more flattering way and gave her tips on how to present herself to best advantage. "You have lovely bone structure," Sarah told her as they sat in front of a small mirror in their shared room. "Your family did you no favors by making you dress so plainly. These colors you're wearing now are much better for your complexion." Margaret felt a warm glow at these compliments. After a lifetime of being told she was plain and unremarkable, it was wonderful to have someone point out her positive features. Sarah also shared practical advice about managing a household on the frontier and dealing with the loneliness that could come with living far from civilization. "The key to happiness in a marriage," Sarah told her, "especially in frontier conditions, is to see your husband as a partner in building something together. Don't think of yourself as just a wife. Think of yourself as a partner in creating a life and a legacy." As they approached the Texas border, Margaret felt her excitement building. She was only a day away from meeting Samuel Crawford and discovering whether this bold gamble would pay off. She spent the last evening of her journey writing in her journal, documenting her thoughts and feelings before everything changed. "Tomorrow I meet the man who may become my husband," she wrote. "I don't know what to expect, but I know I am not the same woman who left Boston 2 weeks ago. I have learned to trust my own judgment, to speak up for myself, and to see myself as capable of handling whatever comes. Whether Mr. Crawford accepts me or rejects me, I have already proven to myself that I can survive and thrive on my own terms." The final day of travel took them through the Texas countryside toward the town of Cedar Creek, where Samuel Crawford would be waiting to meet her. Margaret had studied the map carefully and knew that his ranch was located about 10 miles outside the town, in an area known for its excellent grazing land and natural water sources. As the stagecoach rolled through the Texas landscape, Margaret was struck by the beauty of the country. Rolling hills covered with tall grass stretched as far as she could see, dotted with groves of oak and mesquite trees. Wildflowers bloomed along the roadside in brilliant yellows, reds, and purples. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing peacefully, tended by cowboys on horseback. "First time in Texas?" asked the traveling salesman, noticing her fascination with the scenery. "Yes," Margaret replied, "and I think I'm going to love it here." The salesman laughed. "It's different from back east, that's for certain. Takes a special kind of person to thrive out here. But those who do, they never want to leave." As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, Margaret could see the buildings of Cedar Creek appearing on the horizon. Her heart began to race with anticipation and nervousness. In less than an hour, she would meet Samuel Crawford and discover whether her family's cruel joke would become her greatest triumph. She opened her reticule and checked her appearance in her small traveling mirror one last time. Her hair was neatly arranged, her dress was clean and pressed despite the long journey, and her eyes were bright with determination. She looked like a woman ready to embrace whatever the future might bring. "Whatever happens next," Margaret whispered to herself, "I'm ready for it." The stagecoach rolled into Cedar Creek just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Margaret gathered her belongings, took a deep breath, and prepared to step into the next chapter of her life. Behind her lay a family who had sent her away as a joke. Ahead of her waited a man who might see her as she truly was, not the ugly daughter, but a woman of worth, intelligence, and strength. As the stagecoach came to a stop in front of the town's only hotel, Margaret saw a tall man in a well-tailored suit standing on the wooden sidewalk, scanning the passengers as they emerged. Even without an introduction, she somehow knew this was Samuel Crawford, and from the way he was watching the stagecoach with eager anticipation, she could tell that he was genuinely excited about meeting his potential bride. Margaret squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and prepared to meet her destiny. Samuel Crawford stood outside the Cedar Creek Hotel, his hat in his hands and his heart beating faster than it had in years. At 32, he had built one of the most successful ranches in Texas through sheer determination and back-breaking work. But he had never been as nervous as he was at this moment, waiting to meet the woman who might become his wife. He had arrived in town 3 hours early, unable to concentrate on anything else. Samuel had spent the morning getting a haircut and a shave, ensuring his best suit was perfectly pressed, and going over in his mind everything he wanted to say to Margaret Sullivan. The letters of recommendation he had received painted a picture of an exceptional woman, intelligent, practical, and capable, exactly the kind of partner he needed to help him build something lasting in this wild country. As the stagecoach rounded the corner and pulled up in front of the hotel, Samuel felt his palms grow damp with nervous perspiration. He had been corresponding with potential brides for months, but something about Margaret's recommendation had stood out from all the others. The way her family had described her mathematical abilities and business acumen had impressed him far more than the usual references to beauty and social graces that filled most such letters. The stagecoach door opened and passengers began to emerge. First came a traveling salesman Samuel recognized from previous trips, then an elderly woman visiting family, followed by a young minister and his wife. Samuel watched anxiously, wondering if Margaret had missed the coach or decided not to come after all. Then she appeared in the doorway of the stagecoach, and Samuel felt his breath catch in his throat. The woman stepping down from the coach was not what he had expected, but she was far more than he had dared to hope for. Margaret Sullivan was certainly not a conventional beauty, but there was something about her that commanded attention. She moved with quiet confidence, her posture erect and her gaze direct. Her brown hair was arranged simply but elegantly, and her traveling dress, while practical, was well cut and flattering. Most importantly, her eyes held an intelligence and strength that spoke of depths yet to be discovered. Samuel found himself staring as Margaret collected her belongings and looked around the small town with obvious curiosity and interest. When her gaze met his across the dusty street, he saw no coquetry or false modesty in her expression, only genuine warmth and a straightforward assessment of him in return. Margaret had spotted him immediately as well. The tall man in the well-tailored suit was clearly out of place among the rough cowboys and frontier merchants who populated the street. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his beard well-groomed, and his clothes spoke of success and prosperity. But what impressed her most was the way he looked at her, with genuine interest and respect, not the dismissive glances she was accustomed to receiving from men. Samuel approached the stagecoach, his hat still in his hands, and addressed her directly. "Miss Sullivan? I'm Samuel Crawford. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." His voice was deep and pleasant, with a slight drawl that spoke of his years in Texas. When Margaret placed her gloved hand in his for the introduction, she felt a warm strength that suggested he was accustomed to physical work despite his prosperous appearance.
Mr.
"Crawford," Margaret replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "The journey was long but quite educational. I'm very pleased to meet you." Samuel gestured toward the hotel behind them. "I've taken the liberty of reserving a room for you here tonight. I thought you might want to rest and refresh yourself before we discuss our arrangement. Would you join me for dinner this evening? We could talk and get to know each other a bit." Margaret appreciated his consideration and the respectful way he approached their unusual situation. "That sounds perfect. I would very much like to hear about your ranch and your plans for the future." As Samuel helped her carry her luggage into the hotel, Margaret was struck by how different this felt from any interaction she had ever had with a man. There were no awkward attempts at flattery, no condescending remarks about her appearance, and no suggestion that she should defer to him simply because he was male. Instead, Samuel treated her like an equal, someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered. The hotel room Samuel had reserved for her was simple but clean, with a comfortable bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street of Cedar Creek. Margaret was touched to discover that he had also arranged for a hot bath to be prepared and had left a small bouquet of wildflowers on the dresser with a note that read, "Welcome to Texas. I hope you'll find it as wonderful as I do." After bathing and changing into one of her better dresses, a deep green silk that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes, Margaret made her way downstairs to the hotel dining room. Samuel was waiting for her at a corner table, and she noticed that he had also taken care with his appearance, changing into a fresh shirt and jacket. As they were seated, Margaret couldn't help but compare this experience to the few formal dinners she had attended with potential suitors in Boston. Those occasions had always been stilted affairs with conversation limited to safe topics like the weather and social gossip. Samuel, however, seemed genuinely interested in learning about her as a person. "Tell me about your journey," he said as they waited for their food to arrive. "What did you think of the country as you traveled through it?" Margaret found herself describing her trip in detail, sharing her observations about the different landscapes she had seen and the people she had met along the way. Samuel listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine interest in her experiences. I was particularly fascinated by the livestock market in Chicago, Margaret admitted. I spent several hours there learning about cattle breeding and market prices. I hope that doesn't seem too forward of me. Samuel's eyes lit up with pleasure. Forward? Not at all. Most people assume that ranching is simple work, but it's actually quite complex. The fact that you took the initiative to learn about it tells me a great deal about your character. As their conversation continued over dinner, Margaret felt herself relaxing in a way she rarely had around men. Samuel asked about her experience managing her father's business accounts, and when she described some of the improvements she had implemented, he nodded with understanding and appreciation. You clearly have a talent for organization and financial planning, he told her. Those skills would be invaluable in running a large ranch operation. I've been doing all the bookkeeping myself, but as the business grows, I really need someone with your expertise to help manage the financial side. Margaret felt a warm glow at his recognition of her abilities. For the first time in her life, a man was discussing her skills as assets rather than oddities to be overlooked or hidden. Tell me about your ranch, she requested. What are your goals and dreams for it? Samuel's face animated as he began describing his property and his vision for its future. He owned 5,000 acres of some of the best grazing land in Texas, with natural springs that provided reliable water even during dry seasons. His current herd numbered about 2,000 head, but he planned to expand significantly over the next few years. The railroad is coming to this part of Texas within the next 3 years, he explained excitedly. When that happens, we'll have direct access to markets in Chicago and New York. Ranchers who are positioned correctly will be able to sell their cattle for prices we can only dream of now. Margaret listened intently as Samuel outlined his business plans, his methods for improving his herd through selective breeding, and his ideas for diversifying his operations. She was impressed not only by the scope of his vision but also by the careful planning and attention to detail that supported it. What about the practical aspects of living on a ranch? Margaret asked. I imagine it's quite different from city life. Samuel nodded seriously. It can be isolated, especially for someone accustomed to Boston society. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles away, and town is a 2-hour ride. The work is hard, and there are real dangers, severe weather, wild animals, and occasionally troublesome men who think isolated ranches are easy targets. Margaret appreciated his honesty about the challenges she would face. How do you handle the isolation? Don't you get lonely? Sometimes, Samuel admitted. That's one of the reasons I decided to seek a wife through correspondence rather than trying to court someone locally. I need a partner who can handle the demands of frontier life, someone intelligent enough to help me build something lasting out here. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself increasingly impressed with Samuel Crawford. He was clearly intelligent, hardworking, and ambitious, but he was also thoughtful and considerate. Most importantly, he seemed to value her mind and abilities rather than focusing solely on her appearance or social connections. When Samuel walked her back to her room at the end of the evening, he paused outside her door with obvious reluctance to end their conversation. I hope I haven't overwhelmed you with too much information about ranch life, he said. I know this must all seem very different from what you're accustomed to. Margaret shook her head. Not overwhelmed at all. In fact, I find it fascinating. I've spent my whole life in a world where women are expected to be decorative rather than useful. The idea of being a true partner in building something meaningful is very appealing. Samuel's smile was warm and genuine. Would you like to see the ranch tomorrow? I could show you the property and give you a better sense of what our life together might be like. I would love that, Margaret replied without hesitation. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret reflected on how different this day had been from what she had expected. Her family had sent her to Texas as a cruel joke, expecting her to be rejected and humiliated. Instead, she had found a man who seemed to appreciate exactly the qualities her family had always criticized. Samuel Crawford didn't care that she wasn't conventionally beautiful. He was interested in her mind, her abilities, and her character. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt valued for who she truly was, rather than dismissed for what she wasn't. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for visiting the ranch. Samuel arrived at the hotel with a comfortable buggy and a gentle mare for Margaret to ride if she preferred. He had also brought a picnic lunch prepared by his housekeeper, Mrs. King. Garcia, who he explained had been managing his household since he first bought the ranch. As they drove through the Texas countryside toward his property, Samuel pointed out landmarks and explained the geography of the area. Margaret was amazed by the vastness of the landscape and the sense of freedom it conveyed. After a lifetime of feeling confined by social expectations and family disapproval, the open country seemed to offer unlimited possibilities. When they reached the ranch, Margaret's first impression was one of prosperity and careful management. The buildings were well maintained and efficiently arranged. The fences were in good repair, and the cattle she could see in the distance looked healthy and well fed. This was clearly the property of a successful and thoughtful businessman. Samuel's house was larger than Margaret had expected. A two-story structure built of stone and wood, with a wide porch that offered views of the surrounding countryside. Inside, the furnishings were simple but comfortable, chosen for durability and practicality rather than fashion. Mrs. Garcia keeps everything running smoothly, Samuel explained as he showed Margaret through the rooms, but I've always felt the house needed a woman's touch to make it a real home. Margaret could see the potential in the house immediately. With some feminine touches and better organization, it could become a warm and welcoming home. She also noticed that the office where Samuel conducted his business was filled with ledgers, correspondence, and financial records that clearly needed better organization. "Would you like to see the rest of the operation?" Samuel asked. They spent the morning touring the ranch, with Samuel explaining his breeding program, his methods for managing the grassland, and his plans for expansion. Margaret was impressed by the complexity of the operation and the level of knowledge required to run it successfully. At one point, they encountered several of Samuel's cowboys working to repair a fence. Margaret noticed how respectfully they treated their boss and how seriously they took their work. These men clearly admired Samuel and took pride in working for him. "Mr. Crawford," one of the cowboys called out, "we've got that section finished. Should we move on to the north pasture?" "Yes, thank you, Tom," Samuel replied. Then he turned to Margaret. "Tom's been with me for 4 years. He's one of the best horsemen I've ever seen." Margaret watched the interaction with interest, noting how Samuel balanced authority with respect in dealing with his employees. This was the mark of a good leader, someone who could inspire loyalty through fair treatment and clear expectations. As they shared their picnic lunch under the shade of an ancient oak tree, Samuel asked Margaret about her own goals and dreams for the future. "I've always wanted to be useful," she said honestly. "In Boston, I felt like I was just taking up space, contributing nothing of value to anyone. Here, I could see myself making a real difference, helping to build something important." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Margaret, I need to ask you something directly. Your family's letter of recommendation was very impressive, but I'm curious about their feelings regarding your coming to Texas. Were they supportive of this decision?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, then decided to be completely honest. "My family sent me here as a joke," she said quietly. "They expected you to reject me and send me back to Boston humiliated. They thought it would teach me to accept my proper place as the plain, unmarriageable daughter." Samuel's face darkened with anger. "They sent you here as a joke? How could any family treat their daughter so cruelly?" "Because they've never been able to see past my appearance to who I really am," Margaret replied. "But perhaps that's been a blessing in disguise. If they had recognized my worth, I might never have had the courage to leave Boston and seek a different kind of life." Samuel reached across and took her hand gently. "Margaret, I want you to know that I don't see anything plain or unmarriageable about you. I see an intelligent, capable woman who could be the perfect partner for building a life in this country. Your family's loss is my gain." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. After a lifetime of being made to feel worthless, she had finally found someone who could see her true value. As the afternoon wore on and they prepared to return to town, Samuel made the proposal that would change both their lives forever. As the sun began to set over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Samuel and Margaret sat on the porch of his ranch house, watching the cattle graze peacefully in the distance. The day had been perfect. Margaret had seen every aspect of the ranch operation and had asked intelligent, insightful questions that impressed Samuel more with each passing hour. "Margaret," Samuel said, turning to face her directly, "I know we've only known each other for 2 days, but I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to meet someone like you. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Margaret's heart raced, but not with fear or uncertainty. Instead, she felt a deep sense of rightness, as if all the painful years in Boston had been leading her to this moment. "Yes, Samuel," she replied without hesitation. "I would be honored to marry you." The simplicity and honesty of their proposal was exactly right for both of them. There were no flowery speeches or dramatic gestures, just two practical people recognizing that they had found their perfect match. They were married 3 days later in Cedar Creek's small church, with the minister who had traveled on the stagecoach with Margaret performing the ceremony. Mrs. Garcia served as Margaret's witness, and Tom, Samuel's foreman, stood up for the groom. It was a simple ceremony, but it felt more genuine and meaningful to Margaret than any elaborate Boston wedding could have been. As they settled into married life, Margaret threw herself into a new role with enthusiasm and determination. She immediately took over management of the household accounts and business records, organizing Samuel's financial information with the same skill she had applied to her father's shipping business. Within weeks, she had identified several areas where they could reduce costs and increase profits. "Look at this," she told Samuel one evening, spreading ledgers across the kitchen table. "You've been paying too much for feed because you're buying in small quantities. If we coordinate with 2 other ranchers and purchase together, we can negotiate a much better price."
Samuel studied her calculations and shook his head in amazement. "You're absolutely right."
"I never thought to approach it that way. This could save us hundreds of dollars a year." Margaret also proved invaluable in other aspects of ranch management. She studied veterinary guides and learned to treat common cattle ailments, saving them the expense and delay of calling for the doctor from town for minor problems. She established a garden that provided fresh vegetables for the household and experimented with preserving techniques that ensured they had good food through the winter months. Perhaps most importantly, Margaret brought a warmth and organization to the household that transformed the ranch house into a real home. She sewed curtains for the windows, arranged furniture to create comfortable conversation areas, and established routines that made daily life more pleasant and efficient. The cowboys who worked for Samuel quickly came to respect and admire Margaret. Unlike many ranch wives who looked down on the hired hands, Margaret treated them with courtesy and consideration. She learned their names, remembered details about their families, and often sent food out to them when they were working in distant pastures. "Your missus is a real lady," Tom told Samuel one day. "She's got class, but she ain't stuck up about it. The boys all think you hit the jackpot." Samuel couldn't have agreed more. Every day brought new evidence of how perfectly suited Margaret was to their life together. She was interested in every aspect of the ranch operation and contributed valuable insights to his decision-making process. When he was planning to expand their cattle herd, Margaret created detailed financial projections that helped him determine the optimal size and timing for the expansion. 3 months after their marriage, Margaret made a discovery that confirmed what both of them had suspected. She was pregnant. The news filled both of them with joy, not just for the child itself, but for what it represented about their future together. "I can't wait to teach our children about ranching," Samuel said as they sat on their porch one evening, his hand resting on Margaret's still flat stomach. "With your brains and my experience, they'll be unstoppable." Margaret laughed, feeling happier than she had ever imagined possible. "I hope they inherit your kindness and strength," she replied. "Those qualities will serve them well no matter what they choose to do with their lives." As word of Margaret's pregnancy spread through the community, she received visits from other ranch wives who had previously been reserved in their acceptance of the newcomer from Boston. They found Margaret to be knowledgeable, practical, and completely without pretension, qualities that were highly valued on the frontier. Patterson, whose husband owned the neighboring ranch, became a close friend. "I was worried when Samuel said he was marrying a woman from back east," she confided to Margaret during one of their visits. "We've seen too many city women come out here expecting frontier life to be like a romantic novel. But you're different. You understand what this life requires." Margaret's reputation in the community was further enhanced when she used her mathematical skills to help resolve a dispute between 2 ranchers over water rights. The complex calculations required to determine fair usage had stumped everyone involved until Margaret worked out a solution that satisfied both parties. "That woman's got a head for figures like I've never seen," one of the ranchers told Samuel afterward. "You're lucky to have her." Samuel knew how lucky he was, but he was reminded of it again when he received an unexpected letter from Boston 6 months after their marriage. The letter was from Margaret's father, and its contents revealed just how much Margaret's family had underestimated her. "My dear Crawford," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well. I am writing to inquire about my daughter Margaret's situation. We have not heard from her since she arrived in Texas, and we are beginning to worry that something might have gone wrong." The letter went on to suggest that perhaps Margaret had proven unsuitable for ranch life and offered to arrange for her return to Boston with no hard feelings on either side. Thomas Sullivan clearly still believed that his eldest daughter was destined for failure and humiliation. Samuel showed the letter to Margaret, who read it with a mixture of amusement and sadness. "They still don't understand," she said quietly. "Even after all this time, they can't imagine that I might actually succeed at something." "Would you like to write back to them?" Samuel asked. Margaret considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I think it's time they learned the truth." The letter Margaret wrote to her family was masterful in its restraint and dignity. She described her new life in positive but matter-of-fact terms, mentioning Samuel's successful ranch, their comfortable home, and their expectation of a child. She avoided any hint of boasting or bitterness, instead presenting a picture of quiet contentment and purposeful living. "I want to thank you for sending me to Texas," she wrote in closing. "What you intended as a lesson in humility has instead taught me the value of finding someone who appreciates my true worth. Samuel and I are very happy together, and we're building something meaningful and lasting. I hope you can find happiness in knowing that your joke has turned out to be the greatest blessing of my life." When Margaret's family received this letter, along with a photograph of her and Samuel standing proudly in front of their ranch house, the reaction was exactly what Margaret had expected. Eleanor Sullivan was furious that her plan had backfired so completely, while Thomas was forced to confront the fact that he had seriously undervalued his eldest daughter. Catherine and Isabella, meanwhile, were both struggling with disappointing marriages to men who had initially been attracted to their beauty, but had little interest in their personalities or abilities. Seeing Margaret's obvious happiness and success was a bitter reminder of opportunities they might have missed by focusing only on surface attractions. "I don't understand it," Eleanor complained to her husband. "How could that plain, awkward girl have managed to land such a successful husband? It makes no sense." But Thomas, who had always been the more practical of the two, was beginning to understand exactly what had happened. "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully, "we never really saw Margaret clearly. Perhaps we were so focused on what she wasn't that we never noticed what she was." Back in Texas, Margaret and Samuel's happiness continued to grow along with their success. The railroad arrived ahead of schedule, and Samuel's strategic planning paid off handsomely. Their cattle brought premium prices at market, and they were able to expand their operations significantly. Margaret proved to be an excellent manager of their growing wealth. She invested wisely, maintained detailed records, and ensured that they lived comfortably without extravagance. She also insisted that they set aside money for their children's education and for helping their community develop schools and churches. When their first child was born, a daughter they named Sarah, Margaret experienced a joy she had never imagined possible. Holding her baby in her arms, she made a silent promise that this child would never experience the rejection and dismissal that had marked her own childhood. "She's beautiful," Samuel said as he held his daughter for the first time. "She's perfect," Margaret corrected gently. "Beautiful or not, she's perfect exactly as she is." Samuel understood the deeper meaning behind her words and squeezed her hand in agreement. Their children would be raised to value character, intelligence, and kindness above superficial qualities. Over the next 5 years, Margaret and Samuel had 3 more children, 2 sons and another daughter. The Crawford Ranch became one of the most successful operations in Texas, known for its excellent cattle, efficient management, and fair treatment of employees. Margaret became a respected leader in the community, helping to establish the area's first school and serving on various committees that worked to improve life for frontier families. Her reputation for fairness, intelligence, and practical problem-solving made her a natural choice when disputes needed mediating or community projects required organizing. Samuel often marveled at how perfectly his life had turned out. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your family hadn't sent you to Texas?" he asked Margaret one evening as they watched their children play in the yard.
Margaret considered the question seriously.
"I think eventually I would have found a way to leave Boston on my own," she said. "I couldn't have continued living that way indefinitely. But I'm grateful that circumstances brought me here so early, before I wasted any more years feeling worthless and unwanted." "Their loss was definitely my gain," Samuel replied, pulling her close. "I can't imagine my life without you." 10 years after their marriage, Margaret received one final letter from Boston. This one was from Catherine, whose own marriage had ended in divorce. A scandalous situation that had ruined her social standing and left her with few options for the future. "Dear Margaret," the letter began, "I hope you can forgive the years of silence and find it in your heart to offer some advice to your foolish sister. My marriage has failed, and I find myself alone and uncertain about my future. I have been thinking about our childhood and realizing how terribly we treated you. You were always the wisest of us, and I wonder if you might have some guidance for someone who has made so many mistakes." Margaret showed the letter to Samuel, who shook his head sadly. "Will you help her?" "Of course," Margaret replied without hesitation. "She's family, and everyone deserves a chance to start over." Margaret's response to Catherine was warm and generous, offering practical advice about finding meaningful work and building a life based on personal worth rather than social expectations. She also extended an invitation for Catherine to visit Texas if she wanted to see a different way of living. "I learned something important when I came to Texas," Margaret wrote. "Real happiness comes from being valued for who you truly are, not from trying to be what others expect you to be. There's someone out there who will appreciate your genuine self, but first you have to discover and value that person yourself." Catherine did eventually visit Texas, and seeing Margaret's life firsthand completed her transformation. The sister who had once mocked Margaret's plainness now saw a woman who was genuinely beautiful in all the ways that mattered, confident, capable, loved, and loving in return. Margaret and Samuel's marriage became legendary in their community as an example of what could be achieved when two people truly understood and appreciated each other. Their ranch prospered beyond their wildest dreams. Their children grew up happy and confident, and they remained devoted partners until Samuel's death at the age of 78. When Margaret was asked, late in her life, about the secret to their successful marriage, she always gave the same answer: "We saw each other clearly from the very beginning.
Samuel never tried to change me, and I never tried to change him.
We just worked together to build something better than either of us could have achieved alone." The woman who had been sent to Texas as a cruel joke had indeed found her perfect match. Not despite her differences from conventional expectations, but because of them. In Samuel Crawford, Margaret found a man who valued intelligence over beauty, character over social standing, and partnership over mere appearance. Their love story became proof that real beauty lies not in meeting society's narrow standards, but in finding someone who appreciates your authentic self. Margaret's family had intended to teach her a lesson about her limitations, but instead they had given her the opportunity to discover her true worth. In the end, the joke was on them, and Margaret had the last laugh. Though it was the gentle, satisfied laughter of a woman who had found her place in the world and built a life of meaning, love, and lasting happiness.